Good morning from the Anne Springs Close Greenway. I'm here at the Dairy Barn entrance. I'm Elizabeth Bowers, Communications Director for the Greenway, here today with Joe and Flora Doraski, two of our volunteer instructors and graduates of our Master Naturalist program. And we're here to talk about history on the Greenway, and a lot of awesome history right here in our backyard. And Joe and Flora are going to walk us through some of the highlights this morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you today? I hope you're having a good day and have lots of good plans in your social distancing and keeping away from everyone and still enjoying what we have around us. Today we're going to talk about history and the Greenway. Some of you may or may not realize how much history there actually is surrounding the Anne Springs Close Greenway. And we're going to start by talking about the road that we are standing on. It's called the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road. Flora has a picture here of the main Philadelphia Wagon Road, the main portion that went from Philadelphia down to Augusta, Georgia. It was the main north-south route that the pioneers took to come down into the Carolinas. We're in the South Carolina portion, of course, but this road was an Indian trail. Prior to that, it was an animal trail, and it was used by the animals for foraging and then by the Native Americans to actually fight with one another and to collect food as well. The pioneers adopted it because it was a road that was already here, and they started coming down in the mid-18th century, so that would be about 1750 or so that they came down this road. Now the road that we're on now is called the Nation Ford section of the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road. And Flora, maybe you can explain what Nation Ford stands for?
Okay, well, nation refers to the Catawba Nation that were the first inhabitants of this area. And the ford is the crossing, the one reliable crossing of the Catawba River in Rock Hill, which is the present day 21 at the pump house. So when you go over there, just think about early pioneers. That's how they crossed the river. It was a low point. Now, because we have Duke Energy damming things, the river kind of maintains a constant level. But during pioneer times, that was a low point where you could safely cross without having to have a bridge or a ferry, which would have been a boat to help you cross. Now, how did the pioneers get here, Joe? Well,
the pioneers got here in two different ways. They could have come by horseback, but of course horseback gives you a problem because you need to take and carry your materials that you need to establish your homestead here in South Carolina or North Carolina or wherever you were able to obtain land. So they used a wagon, okay, that was called a Conestoga Wagon. Now, this wagon was a manufactured wagon, okay, which means that it was made in Conestoga, Pennsylvania, and it was made to carry freight. Now, if you'll notice, if you can see your picture fairly clearly here, I hope, you'll notice that it has a bowed bottom, and that's to keep your materials from shifting around in the bottom of the wagon. Also, the bottom of the wagon was caulked so that the water out, especially if you had to cross a stream with your wagon. It had drop gates on each side so you could get your goods in and out. One interesting thing that about the Conestoga wagon is that it was not a wagon that you rode in. You walked next to it. Now, if you were coming down in your wagon, you probably made about 10 miles a day, and which would mean that the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road which is 700 miles long, it would take you a couple of months, okay, to travel from Philadelphia down to an area such as South Carolina.
So if you were a family traveling, you would basically get up in the morning, and Mom would probably take and reheat what she had made for dinner the night before, and that would be your breakfast. And then you would just pack up everything and you would start to walk, including the driver. They would walk along the side. Sometimes there would be a seat for them, but pretty much everybody walked, okay? And you would start at sunup and you would walk to sundown. You may rest periodically along the way, but the rest wasn't for you. It was for the animals that were pulling your wagon, because if something happened to them, you were stuck. It wasn't like getting a flat tire where you could just change it. They were your engine, okay? So you were resting for your animals. You'd probably have, again, maybe some bread or cheese as your afternoon meal. And then at sundown, that's when you would think about stopping, and you'd make your campfire, and that's where Mom would then prepare a meal. Again, that would be the meal that would get you through the next day also. Let's see, the wagon itself, how big was it?
Well, the wagon itself, they varied in size, okay? The average was about 5 feet wide and about 20 feet long, and somewhere 8, 9 feet high. That's with the canvas on top. Now, this board, that interesting fact is that this board that was on the side of the wagon, okay, was used by the driver. He could sit on it and he could drive the horses. If he didn't drive the horses from the board, he either walked next to them or rode one of the horses, which was called the wheel horse, okay? Now, this seat was always on the left side of the Conestoga wagon. This is where we came up with the idea of driving on the left-hand side of the road, okay? And it comes from the fact that these seats were always driven, they always drove their Conestoga wagon from the left side, sitting on this seat.
Well, how would you know that you were still on the road?
Well, the road was not very wide, and in some places was pretty rough, and if you had a storm, okay, then it might be blocked. But along the road there were markers that were placed by local residents, probably because they were getting tired of people asking them for directions. But there were markers that were put down, and we have a couple of those markers here on the Greenway. They were a stone marker put into the ground, okay, and they had something written on the side. This particular one has FM for Fort Mill, and it says Fort Mill 9 miles, okay. On the other side has a C, which is 16 miles to Charlotte, okay, or in pioneer times, Charlottetown, okay. So these were placed along the road. This is an original marker. There are 4 of them on the Greenway. They were saved for us, okay, by a local who recognized what they were and put them aside, and then when the Greenway was developed, he donated them to the Greenway, he or she. And
so they're not in their original position?
They're not in their original position, but this is an original marker.
Okay, they're just kind of placed where they would sort of make sense.
Yeah, it sort of makes sense, right, exactly. Okay, all right, now let's talk about a couple of other historical, we talked about pioneers. Now let's talk about the 2 historic cabins that are located here on the Greenway. Okay, the first one is the Fairs Colthorpe cabin, and that's we're kind of across from it here on what was part of the original Nation Ford section of the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road. Now, we're going to pan the camera around so we can look up at, and I'm going to go right here. So we look up at a cabin, and yep. Okay, we'll talk about the cabin here.
I need my glasses.
Okay.
I need my glasses.
All right. Okay, I've got the sheet here for information. Okay, now Alexander and Jeanette Faires, F-A-I-R-E-S, and there's various spellings of that. Okay, came down the Great Wagon, Philadelphia Wagon Road in 1776, the beginning of the Revolutionary War. In 1813, their son leased 744 acres from a Catawba Indian woman, okay, who leased that to him for 10 years, for 99 years, at $10 a year. Okay, and they established their farm. Now, Alexander and Jeanette's son built this cabin in 1813.
Or approximately. That's
Approximately
what was it? 1813, 1814. I've
Right,
read different
somewhere
times.
in that neighborhood,
Mhm.
okay? Now,
And they lived there and they had some kids. Okay. And then
their
son John inherited the cabin, and he moved in with his wife
Esther Jane.
Esther Jane. Now John, the war between the states developed, and John, being a true Southerner, joined the Confederate Army and went off to war. But he didn't really die in battle, unfortunately. I guess he got dysentery, passed away someplace in Virginia. Esther Jane did not have the funds to bring his body back, so he is buried someplace in Virginia. Now she continued on with her children, living in the cabin during the war years. And at the close of the war, another local Confederate soldier returned home, and that was
Josiah Colthrop.
He marries the widow Ferris, so hence the name Ferris Colthrop Cabin. They continue to live in the cabin, have some more kids. In fact, at one time in the census records, we're shown that 10 people lived in that small cabin.
Wow.
Okay? It is a basic cabin. It would be fun to get inside, because one of the things I always like to show people is it's the original open concept. It's a one-room cabin and everything is there. You have your hearth, which was your source of heat, your source of light at night, and your stove, so multi-purpose. You had a table, which is where you prepared your meals, where you ate your meals, but also where you gathered as a family to maybe play games, to work on homework, whatever, and a bed for sleeping. Okay, so everything took place. Original open concept, what we're all looking for right now. Anything else about Ferris Colthrop?
No, that's, we're going to walk down the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road now.
I knew. Again, this is another thing that is not in its original location. The Colthrop cabin was located on Colthrop Road here in Fort Mill, and at the time that Baxter Village was being developed, it was moved here by the Greenway and placed here at its present location, which is on the Dairy Barn side, right near the Emporium Amphitheater. So when you come out on Thursday nights, hopefully we'll have those happening once we're social distancing over, and you look up, you'll see the cabin. Okay?
Yeah, this is part of the paved loop that we have here on the Greenway, our only paved trail. So it's a great place to get out and explore.
Well, it's a good place for maybe people who have physical challenges.
Yes.
And can't walk trails because of roots and things.
Absolutely.
So a nice area for all people. So are we going to continue?
We're going to walk down the road right now, and we're going to get to the point where we have a more rustic looking portion of the road, which would be much closer to what the pioneers would have experienced. We're walking down towards the Graham cabin, which is the second cabin. We're going to talk about that in a moment. To our right, we have horse fields, okay, where the horses that are boarded here at the Greenway.
Yeah, this is one of our several boarded horse pastures on the property, but they are lovely to look at. You also see a lot of equestrian riders on this side of the Greenway, so we always tell people to be mindful and yield to the horseback riders. This is also a great place to access the swinging bridge, which is just down from the Graham cabin that we're going to be at shortly.
Okay. Let's just walk over here because I like to look down this road because
This gives you a good idea of what the
this
trail
gives you
probably looked like to early pioneers.
and as you can see, there's some debris on this road. Now, debris on the road would cause a major problem to the pioneers. They would either have to move it or they would have to go around it. In some extreme cases, they would actually have to physically take the wagon apart and carry it over the obstacles that were in their way, which would, of course, slow them down considerably. Now, we're going to talk about another historical event that occurred. Not an event really, more of a occurrence that occurred in the Revolutionary War. Okay? In 1780, Lord Cornwallis had a skirmish or battle in the Charlottetown or Charlotte area. He encountered some resistance from the Patriots and decided that he would retreat south and then try to come back again when the weather got better. This was October. He retreated down the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road and crossed over Steel Creek, which is further down the road, somewhere in this area. He had about 4,500 soldiers and supporters with him as he went down this road. Now, it was rainy, it was wet. He lost supplies, he lost wagons. His men and the support for those men were absolutely miserable. Lord Cornwallis himself actually got sick. Now, their idea was to go down and cross the Catawba River. Now, you have to understand a little bit about what was happening in this time period. This was around October 14th in 1780. On October 7th, a major battle had occurred, okay, off to the west at Kings Mountain. So part of Cornwallis's reason for retreating from Charlotte was that he had just gotten word that his forces had been defeated at Kings Mountain. And he wanted to regroup and rethink what he was doing coming up through South Carolina. Again, 1780. Now, he tried to go to the Catawba River and cross the ford, and the water was too high. So he came back. He actually ended up camping on the Spratt Foundation. Now, Thomas Spratt was one of the original settlers of the Fort Mill area. He had a plantation down, it's actually located on Brickyard Road in Fort Mill. He had a plantation. Cornwallis camped there. Now, while he was camped and while he was moving, he was being attacked by a lot of the Patriots in the area. Now, there's different stories about how this occurred, but at some point, one of his commanders came up with the idea that the sitting where he was sitting, it was like sitting in a hornet's nest. He was being attacked at various times by these pesky Patriots. Now, this is where the name Hornets comes from that's associated with this area, is the fact that this was the hornet's nest, okay? Now, of course, we associate it with basketball, but at that time it was associated with the Patriots who were attacking Lord Cornwallis. Eventually, he decided to go to Lansford, okay, to cross. At Lansford, there was a ferry that he could get his people across. Later on, this is very significant because When he tried to come back in the 1781 time period, he actually ended up going to the east of Charlotte and up through, and eventually found himself, at Yorktown, where he was defeated and trapped. So that was the end of the war, essentially. So the South Carolina and the Carolinas played a big part in the defeat of Cornwallis and the establishment of the United States. The next portion that we're going to go to, the next thing we're going to see is the Graham cabin. If you have any questions out there, put them up and we'll try to answer them for you.
None so far, but how long would it have taken to build a cabin like the Ferris Coltharp or the Graham cabin? How long would it have taken?
That's a very interesting question, because we're going to get up to the Graham cabin here, which is made out of American chestnut.
Yeah,
That's a
I don't
very
know.
heavy wood.
I'm not sure how long. That's something I have to look up.
Yeah.
To tell you the truth. I don't know.
I would
That's
think
probably
Did a lot,
Yeah.
so it's probably. I would be surprised at how little time.
Yeah.
And yet, today, we can put up a modern house in takes 3 to 4 months. So I would think almost that, to tell you the truth. Though I guess they didn't have the electrician trades and things like that coming in to get inspections.
exactly.
But
Now,
the neat thing about this cabin is the fact that it is the American chestnut. And Joe, it was supposed to be a good wood because it was resistant to different insects and things like that. But why don't we have American chestnut trees now? And that was because there was a root fungus.
fungus that destroyed the American chestnut forest in the eastern half of the United States. Now, an interesting thing, at one time, American chestnut was about 20% of the forest in the eastern half of the United States, and now it doesn't exist. There have been some experiments to cure this fungus, but essentially, by the mid-1800s, the American chestnut was wiped out. This still exists, and it is certified American chestnut. As I had said, it is a very, very heavy material. So the individuals that carried and put up this cabin, had to be pretty strong. They had to be. There had to be a number of individuals to take and actually make this cabin, build this cabin.
Hey Joe, when was this cabin built?
Okay, this cabin we have from the literature, it looks like this cabin was built in about 1780. We know that in 1810, the census shows that Billy Graham's great-grandfather lived in this cabin. Now, whether he built it or not is not clear from the literature, but we do know that he and his family lived here. And again, how did they get down to the South Carolina area? They came down the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road.
So the Graham cabin was actually built before the Ferris Coltharp cabin, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Now,
But they're pretty much contemporaries.
oh yeah,
We have a question.
Sure.
yes.
Do you know when our section of the Nation Ford Road went out of use and why?
Oh,
Do we
you
know?
have that?
The main reason why it went out of use was the railroad. Okay, what happened? What was the main crop in this area? The main crop in this area was cotton. originally in the mid-1800s, pre-Civil War and post-Civil War, there were no textile mills located here in the Fort Mill area. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but there were no textile mills, so cotton was exported. So originally it was exported in the early 1800s down the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road. However, there was great pressure when the railroad was developed to get the railroad into this area. Once the railroad came, now you could transport your goods and your materials down the railroad, not use the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road or the Nation Ford Road or any of the other local roads.
Got it.
Okay.
Good answer.
Now, the Graham cabin. Billy Graham's great-grandfather lived here in the early 1800s. His grandfather, lived in this home until 1870, so he lived in this home through the Civil War. Now, his grandfather and his uncle fought in the Civil War. They also were members of the South Carolina 6th Infantry. Everyone from this area was in the South Carolina 6th Infantry. Okay? The Graham brothers were as well. Okay? His grandfather carried a Yankee bullet in his leg for the remainder of his life. His uncle, great uncle, actually lost his leg during the war. His nickname when he returned from the war was Peg-Leg Graham, and he was quite a character. He was known, okay, for going to the local tavern, okay, and when he was having an altercation, he would take his leg off and start to swing it around, okay? And he was quite well known in this area. Okay, now, in about 1870, Billy Graham's father moved north to the Charlotte area. Billy Graham was born in the Charlotte area. So, Billy Graham never lived in this cabin, okay? His father lived in this cabin, okay? But his father moved from the cabin in the 1870 approximately. So, the Graham cabin, again, the Graham cabin is not in its original position. It was actually located on Route 160, okay, in I got to get this right here, okay, on Route 160, all right, behind the Philadelphia Methodist Church. That's where it was located, okay, about 2 miles away. Now, it was moved here, but here's an interesting fact. After the Grahams lived in the cabin, a family named Patterson bought the cabin. They actually lived in this cabin until approximately 1990. So, this cabin was lived in for over 200 years, continuously. It never had indoor plumbing, okay? But it did have electricity. When it was moved here, the exterior of the cabin was covered with clapboard, okay? Interior was a drywall type material. That was stripped for historical purposes, and now we see the original American chestnut. And we also would see the same on the inside. Okay, all right.
Good.
We've got to talk about one more thing before we finish our little history lesson here, and that is Civil War textile industry. Okay.
And that brings us to the Springs.
And that brings us to the Springs family, okay?
And though we're not in front of the Springs house, I think everybody is probably familiar with the big white house at the corner of Springfield. And I think it's
Springfield House.
Yes.
Yep.
That was completed in the early 1800s, about 1805. So think about the fact that we have the Ferris Colthrop cabin around 1814. The Graham cabin about 17
80.
And then we have the Springfield House at 1805, 1806. These are contemporary buildings, but they are three very, very different buildings, and shows something about the socioeconomic status of the different people. The Springs, they were plantation owners, and they grew cotton. And probably where I'm standing right now was a cotton field at one time. So that's kind of a neat thing to think about, that this would have been all cotton. Now, why don't we grow cotton anymore?
Okay, now so the Greenway is essentially the Springfield Plantation, about 2,300 acres. Cotton was the main crop grown here.
That's how you made your living.
And that's how you made your living. You sold your cotton. Interesting sidelight is that most of the clothing that people wore was linen, because linen you could grow in your garden, flax, and you could actually make linen at home. Cotton you couldn't really make at home, and that was your money crop. So you didn't want to use it for something like your daily wearing apparel, okay? You wanted to sell that to get your cash. So what happened though? The boll weevil swept through this area and essentially wiped out the cotton in this area.
So that's really why we don't have cotton.
That's really why we don't have cotton.
Okay.
Now, a couple of other historical things. Down this road, another individual came down that has great historical significance, and that's Jefferson Davis. When Richmond fell, Jefferson Davis retreated down through Virginia and was going to attempt to establish another capital somewhere, okay, south. He was not successful in doing that. Eventually, he found himself here. Now, the Springs, okay, were Southern, they were Confederates. So, Jefferson Davis was invited to stay at the Springfield Plantation. He stayed there, and the next day, his cabinet also stayed at the White Homestead, who was a large landholder in the area. And they had the last cabinet meeting on the last Confederate cabinet meeting on the grounds of the White Homestead. At this point, Jefferson Davis went south, okay, and was eventually captured. One significant thing that you should realize is that as he was traveling through this area, he was probably not being chased. The reason is that this was just prior to Lincoln's assassination. When Lincoln was assassinated now, it was assumed that Jefferson Davis was behind it. So now he was being chased. And eventually he was caught up with, okay, in Georgia, okay, and was captured. All right.
We had one question,
yes.
And I think we can all answer this, but what is the Springfield House used for today?
Okay, I'm going to let you answer that.
Springfield House is the headquarters for Leroy Springs and Company, which is the nonprofit organization that owns and operates the Anne Springs Close Greenway. So it's been a corporate headquarters since the late 80s, and before that it was lived in by property managers, farm managers. As the Doraskis mentioned, it was a plantation home, so there was a lot of farming that happened on this property even well beyond the Civil War, and even after cotton kind of peaked, and it was certainly used for other things. And it was all of this area was used also by Springs Farm and the Springs Mills to create opportunities to provide necessary amenities for mill workers. So the dairy barn was a working dairy barn for many years, and it provided the milk for the cafeterias in the Springs Mills here and in the surrounding area. So Springfield House, though, is still our corporate headquarters. About 16 people work there daily, and we hope to eventually make it a historic home on the property, but right now it's still a working house, we like to say.
Oh, very good. Okay, one more thing, which we can't end up without talking about the Springs family. Okay, and Anne Springs Close, and some of the significance of the textile industry in this area. In the late 1800s, the locals in the area realized, hey, we're growing cotton. We're growing cotton in this area. Why don't we just build our textile mills right here? Okay, so the textile mills, okay, were then started. Okay, the Fort Mill Manufacturing Company was founded by Samuel Eliot White. The company eventually ended up with 6 facilities. Okay, there were 2 here in Fort Mill. One of them, okay, if you are familiar with the Elisha Park, that was the location of Fort Mill plant number 1. Okay, now the Samuel Eliot White's son-in-law, who was named Leroy Springs, okay, took over the company and ran it until 1931. At that point, his son, okay, Eliot White Springs, took over in 1931 and into the war, through the war, until the 50s. This is Anne Springs Close's father. He's quite an interesting person. He was actually an ace during World War I. He actually trained pilots during World War II. One interesting thing about him is that during the Depression, he refused, okay, to lay people off. So he just kept building a stockpile of cloth. Along comes World War II, and he is doing really well business-wise because he has this stockpile of cloth that can be used for Army uniforms. Post-war, okay, they come up with the idea of the Spring-Made brand, okay, which at that time was quite risque, because if any of you have seen the advertisements for the Spring-Made brand, you'll see the ladies, okay, with their dresses flying up, okay, and he was attempting to, sell cotton underclothing, okay, sheets, pillowcases as well. Spring-Made van eventually evolved and continues to this day. Now, the Fort Mill Manufacturing, Springs Manufacturing, okay, eventually the manufacturing itself left this area, economics, and is now located overseas. So the manufacturing is located overseas, although the Springs company still does exist. Now, Anne Springs Close, okay, lived in the White Homestead, okay, grew up in the White Homestead. She is a very interesting person, okay, and her children actually donated or gifted this land to the foundation, okay, to be used for a nature center as you see it now. So, the history of this Anne Springs Close Greenway area is rich. What are you going to close with?
I want to thank you for joining us, and I hope that you've learned a little bit about the history of the area this morning. I know, having moved here from Ohio, I wasn't sure what to find when we got here, but we found a really nice home with a lot of friendly people, and I didn't know how much history was involved, especially with the Revolutionary War. This is so rich of an area, and we are so blessed to have this preserved area here at the Greenway. So I'd just like to encourage everybody to come out, enjoy the outdoors here. It's an area where you can hike. It's an area where you can discover new plants, trees, but also walk in the shoes of some of our forebearers, whether they were pioneers, whether they were off fighting the Revolution or the Civil War. It all took place here at the Greenway. So please join us, and thank you this morning.
Yes, thank you. And if there's any more questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, we will make this video available online after it's finishes going live. We'll continue to respond to any questions that we have, and we really appreciate you guys. Again, you know, Miss Close likes to say that if you go about a mile from any entrance, it feels like it used to feel. So you can really take a step back in time here at the Greenway, and we hope that you will. We hope you'll come out and visit with us. So thanks again, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.